Hello and welcome to week 6 of the Mandala Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. I'm Angela Walters, and throughout this video series we have been working through this custom mandala panel starting from the center and working our way out. In the last video we saw how to finish the center part of our panel as well as all the background, and in this video we're going to talk about the borders. For those of you that purchased the optional border panel, I'm going to give you some tips and ideas for quilting this area of your quilt. I'm going to show you how to do it on a sewing machine and a long arm, so let's get to it. When I'm picking out designs for the borders of my quilt, I definitely take into consideration the center. The more complex and ornate the center of the quilt, the less detailed quilting I put in the borders. The main idea being, if the center is meant to shine, I don't want to do any quilting that's going to take away from that. And with this bright, beautiful rainbow mandala, that's definitely the case. We've put so much time and effort in the center of this area, I think it's a great idea to take it a little bit easier in the borders. The borders I designed for this panel are multicolored and kind of busy. That's actually good news. That means really, no matter what quilting we do in that multicolored part, it's not really going to show up. But I'm going to show you how I use the fabric design itself to guide my quilting design choices. But before we get into those designs, I just want to reassure you that even if you're a little nervous about it or newer to machine quilting, this is the perfect area to relax and do something that's easy for you. Remember, when this whole quilt is finished and you stand back and look at it, nobody's going to really be looking at the borders. We're all going to be staring at the beautiful center of this quilt. One way to handle the borders of this quilt is to use the fabric design to your advantage. Simply quilting on the lines in the fabric design is going to allow me to create a cool crosshatch look with no marking. Now, one thing you've probably noticed is that I'm quilting on the panel itself, not the borders actually attached to the quilt. I wish I had a good reason, I just didn't have time to get them added to the quilt before I started quilting. But it's still going to let you see how we can handle these kinds of areas on our quilts. Now, I'm working on the smaller border panel, which is slightly thinner and a little bit smaller scale than the bigger panel. But everything that we're going to see applies to both. Using a ruler, or not, quilt along that white line in between the designs of the fabric. I'm going to start from one edge and work to the opposite edge. Then I'm going to travel to get to the next line so I can repeat, working my way along that panel. Now there's a couple different ways you can approach this. You could quilt all the lines that are going in one direction first and then come back and add the others, or you can switch it up as you go. I myself like to switch up the direction of the lines because it lets me kind of move from one to the next pretty easily. So as I quilt along here, all I'm going to do is travel along the edge to get to a line going in the opposite direction and follow that one, even if it means backing up a bit. Then I'm going to repeat that, quilting the line in the opposite direction, heading back to the opposite side of the border. It just basically means I'm approaching those crosshatches like a zigzag, working my way up and down the area, quilting them in different directions. You know, I don't really know why I do it this way. I think it's just because that's how I've always done it. But like I said, either way, it doesn't matter. You're probably going to notice right off the bat that I have some sections in between those lines that aren't filled in yet, but I'm going to come back and do that whole thing again, and eventually I'll have all those lines quilted. And like I've said throughout this video series, you don't have to use a ruler. You could freehand these if you'd like, no problem. Now since I'm quilting this in a zigzag motion, once I get to a certain point, I can work my way back doing the same thing. Traveling along the edge, quilting a line in one direction, traveling and quilting it in the next. When I get to the edge of this light gray area, I'm traveling along it because I want to do something different in this area. If I wanted to do just cross hatching over the whole border, I would continue that line until I reach the other edge. Even though I don't have a guideline to follow, it's not very long, I can just kind of wing it until I get to that point. Then once I have those diagonal lines all filled in that section, I can move on quilting my next section of lines. When I'm finished, I have a grid quilted that really enhances that fabric pattern and looks nice and classic without taking attention away from the center of the quilt. But one thing we have to consider is the corner. As you can see here, where I've joined the fabric, the lines don't line up close at all. It's really off. So instead of continuing my lines all the way to the edge, I'm going to instead just do a partial line and use a filler to fill in the rest of the area. That's going to give me that same look of the crosshatch, but it's going to keep that corner from looking weird. Basically, instead of quilting along that line all the way to the edge, I'm only going to go out a couple of rows. Then I'll change direction and head back to the center. So it's hard to see, but I have my first triangle here. Inside that triangle, I'm still going to go ahead and follow those lines, but as soon as I reach the outside, I'm going to switch to a filler, such as a swirl, or really any all-over design that you want to quilt. So I'm basically using the filler to work my way around those triangles so I can get in, quilt along those lines, and then get right back out. And I'm going to keep doing that as I work my way down the quilt. And this is definitely something I'm not worrying too much about. I'm not worried if my triangles don't match up with each other. I'm not worried if the spacing between the triangle close to the corner is different than the one on the bottom. I'm just going for that change in texture, just a little bit of a different look in that border. Remember, that busy fabric is going to really make the quilting hard to see anyway. And if I happen to end up in a place other than where I need to be, I'm going to use traveling along the seams to get where I need to go. So this is the first half of my triangle. I filled in all of the space behind it, and now I'm going to keep going on quilting the next part of that triangle. On this corner, the situation is just a little different. It just so happens that the lines of my fabric almost line up. I mean, they're not exact, they're off a little bit, but hey, it's close enough. So in this case, instead of doing the partial crosshatch, I could do the full crosshatch. Just quilting along that line and veering down so that they connect. It's going to look a little bit off, of course, but once I step back and look at the whole quilt, I promise it's not going to be noticeable. Now in this example, I'm quilting in those lines in both directions, but we don't have to do that. We can quilt the lines in one direction and use it as a grid to fill in with different fillers. So I can quilt a line in a certain direction, travel along the edge, and quilt another line back to the other side, and that's going to create a diagonal space that I can then fill in with a different design. Now you don't have to put that filler in all of those sections. You can alternate, you can throw some in here and there for a pop of texture, you can add more echo lines. The possibilities are endless. It's totally up to you and what you feel like quilting at that point. If I want those diagonal lines to be closer together, maybe I want the quilting to be a little bit more dense, I want it to just have a little bit more texture to it, I can quilt along that white line and then quilt along the space in between them. Even though it's not a line, I still have those designs I can use to line up that line and keep it fairly straight. And what's cool about this design idea is those lines don't have to go the same direction around the whole quilt. I can have them facing in one direction in one corner and the other direction in the other, or if it just makes it easier, I can quilt them so they all face the same direction. And then I'm going to repeat that, traveling, quilting, and filling in. I just love making quilting as easy as possible. Of course, if the idea of quilting with rulers and cross-hatching doesn't sound like a great idea to you, you can just do an all-over filler in this area. This fabric is so bright and bold, we're not going to really see the quilting anyway. So it's a great opportunity to practice one of those fillers that you're maybe not as comfortable with, or it's a great opportunity to use one of those designs that you are comfortable with because you know you can get it done quickly. Now I'm using this contrasting thread color so that you can see the quilting, especially in this multicolored fabric. It's hard to see. But if you're quilting along with me on that mandala panel, go ahead and use the white or the yellow thread for this area. Deciding how to quilt that multicolored part of our border is not the difficult part. For me, it was deciding how to quilt the lighter gray section on the other side. So let's explore a couple options for that. Since this section is so narrow, there's really not a whole lot of space to fill it in. I'm going to stick with the design that I know can fit into some smaller areas. Before I get started, I could either decide to treat that whole gray area as one section and fill it in with the design, or I can look at that gold strip right down the center and quilt on either side of it. Now the space is pretty snug, but I'm going to try to fit a feather in there. So treating it almost like a motif, where I have that center teardrop right here in the widest part of that area, and then build off it in one direction, quilting my petals. In this instance, I'm using that gold strip kind of as the spine of my feather. But there is something I need to consider. If this part of my border is on the outside of my quilt, I'm probably going to eventually put some binding on this, so I don't want to quilt my feathers so they go all the way to the edge. I want to leave at least a 1/4 inch space in between that petal and the edge of the area. That's going to give me room to add my binding without cutting off those beautiful feathers. In fact, I might make it just a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. That way, if I need to square up the quilt at all, I won't be cutting into those petals. That means some of these petals are going to be kind of small, and that's fine because I want them to fill that area, but if you're struggling with quilting feathers, this might not be the one to try. I can start from the center, work my way up one side, and I can do the same on the other side. Now since this side is not on the edge of my quilt, I can quilt that petal all the way to that edge. And just because I'm quilting a feather motif doesn't mean it has to extend all the way out to the edges. I can quilt it as big as I want so that it's centered on that border and do a filler in the rest of the area. When I decide I'm done, I'm going to simply put a little teardrop in between the two sides to kind of finish it off, give it a nice closed off end, and then move on. Another thing we can do is quilt that motif, except we can quilt serpentine lines to give it that nice curvy, pointy look. I can still start with that teardrop in the center and then work my way along the rest of that area. Except I'm just going to quilt that line so it curves out, runs into the edge, and then echoes back to the other side. So I'm just quilting that leafy, kind of ferny shape that goes from one side to the other, traveling along that edge just a bit, and then echoing back to the other side. You notice I'm running that design all the way to the edge of the area. In this particular example, it's not necessarily a self-contained motif. I don't mind if it gets cut off because I'm still going to get that curvy, pointy part to the edge. If you do want it to look more like a plume feather, you can quilt that line out to the edge, stopping about 1/4 inch from the edge, and then echoing right back. And you can keep doing that all the way to the end of the area, and then repeat on the other side, or you can cut it off at any point and make it smaller like we did on that feather. Again, putting something in between the two just to finish it off and make it look like it's done. I don't want it to look like I just forgot to come back and finish it. Now I've quilted a motif with two different options on either side just to give you an idea of what both looks like. But I definitely wouldn't do something like this on the whole quilt. I would choose either feather on both sides or serpentine line on both sides. And if we flip the quilt over to the back where I've used a contrasting fabric so you can see just the quilting, we can see how we can use the straight lines to break up the area and fill in with different fillers, how we can create a feather motif as long or as short as we want, and a couple different options on the other side. Using the designs in the fabric to help give me registration lines to follow or to help mark out boundaries to fill in makes the quilting so much easier and quicker. So whether you decide to quilt a motif in the gray part or just do it all over, whether you decide to do cross hatching or just do a filler, it's going to look great no matter what you pick. All right, for the last time this video series, I'm going to tell you it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the challenge and you got the optional borders, go ahead and quilt the rest of your quilt with the designs of your choice. And even though this is the last video in the Mandala Free Motion Challenge quilting along, don't be sad, because I'll be announcing our next video series in March. In the meantime, join me on Thursdays at 3 p.m. Central for my live chat, where I talk about things all related to machine quilting and answer your questions live. All right here on my YouTube channel. Well, until then everybody, stay safe and happy quilting.